Welcome to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg. Think about it. Our view of God determines what we think on all moral, cultural, and economic issues. It even determines how we vote. Hope for the future of our country, of your country, of my country, of our very world lies in our ability to make God the issue in every issue. Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Uvalde, Texas. What do all these places bring to mind? School shootings and a broken view of God. Today, part 2 of a 2-part series of God and gun control. Brad Bright's here to finish up giving us his perspective and a perspective we all can share on God and gun control. Brad Bright, thanks for being back.
Great to be here, Jim.
Brad, last week's conversation ended on a doozy. So I want to start back where we left off. Please tell us, what do you think is the primary cause of gun violence?
Well, there are a lot of causes,
But we're talking about the primary cause.
but I think the primary cause is education that omits God. That is teaching children that God does not exist, or in effect, that God is irrelevant, which is typical public school today. And therefore, there's no accountability in the universe, no moral accountability. And you look at that in conjunction with survival of the fittest, where the strong survive and the weak die. And what you have effectively done is you've taught young people that violence is okay because God does not exist. Therefore, there's no moral accountability. It's survival of the fittest. The strong survive, the weak die. You have just taught them to resort to violence. And that's not a possibility. That's almost inevitable. Actually, it is inevitable.
And we're seeing it played out every day. So what you said at the end of last week's podcast was that the primary cause of gun violence is primarily a spiritual issue. Can you lay that out for us?
If it is, it is. If there is no God, when we're talking about God, we're talking about spiritual issues. If there is no God, there is no ultimate moral authority in the universe. And if that's the case, then we each become our own gods. We each decide for ourselves what's good, what's bad, what's good, what's evil. That's scary. You let a 16-year-old decide what's good, what's evil? Really? Are you comfortable with that? Of telling them, in effect, you're God, you get to decide that for yourself? That is where the real problem is coming from. Again, if there's no God, then morality is a fairy tale, just like Santa Claus or Easter Bunny. You know, if you disagree with me, then you need to answer this one question. What in the universe obligates me to treat you with kindness? What in the universe obligates me to treat you with kindness if God doesn't exist? And especially if survival of the fittest is the way in which this planet was populated. You see, if there's no God, why is love better than hate? Why is it wrong to cut the legs and arms off of an unborn fetus? If there's no God, what's wrong with two guys having sex? Why is murder wrong? The point is, you may not like it, but that doesn't make it wrong.
You mentioned that you've been saying these things for 20 years. Have you been proven wrong in 20 years?
I think the last 20 years have shown that I'm right. Why? Gun violence has gotten worse. And what's going on at the same time? More divorces, more dads walking out, more drug and alcohol abuse, more addiction to pornography, Hollywood producing worse and worse stuff coming out all the time. All for what? For money. And why can they do it? They can justify it because when you start with survival of the fittest, you can't say that Hollywood is doing anything wrong. See, a broken view of God leads people to suicide, leads people to embrace violence. At the end of the day, a broken view of God leads to alienation from God and therefore alienation from others. And we see that with technology in our society all the time. And alienation drives people to do horrible things. I'll tell you what, we can pass a bunch of gun control laws. It won't take care of the violence.
Well, is there proof of that?
Pardon?
Is there proof of that? That if you pass gun control laws, it won't solve the problem? Are there cities or areas in our country where they've passed gun control laws where it hasn't solved the problem?
Well, first of all, as a nation, we have stricter gun control laws than we did 20 years ago, and yet the violence is still worse. And it's continuing to get worse. Look at England today. The average citizen can't own a gun. And so what are they doing? They're focusing on knife control, knife crime prevention. And if you don't believe me, go start reading what they're doing over in England and Scotland to prevent knife-related crimes, because the last decade, what's been going up, knife crimes related to knives have been going up. So yes, there's clear evidence out there. What I'm saying is true. What else have we seen now? Is now people are using cars to kill other people. I mean, we've seen that a number of times in the last 2 or 3 years of people driving cars into groups of people in order to do mass killing and mass violence. So gun control only suppresses the symptom. It doesn't even begin to address what's driving the violence. And let me say what I ended with last time. Your children will never be safe as long as we continue to exclude God from the conversation and God from education.
Seems pretty like a hopeless conversation, Brad. Can you give us some hope?
I can. And this is where we get into how do you frame the issue? How do you have this conversation so that we actually can make forward progress rather than continue just to say, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it, which is all gun control is saying, stop it. And well, that doesn't do any good.
All right.
Gun control completely ignores the root cause of gun violence.
When we come back,
deal with the root cause. Anyway, go on.
No, I'm sorry. When we come back, I want to
got to
dig
deal with the
deeper.
root cause of violence if we want to solve the problem. And if we don't, we won't solve the problem.
Just as we just talked over each other, I mean, people talk over each other on this issue in society. Just it's so touchy because people that are pro gun control think that it will solve a problem, and people who are not pro gun control think it won't solve the problem. So there's such a disparity. When we come back, can we lay out how to make God the issue in this issue? Can we bring God into this?
Because that's what we have to do if we're going to actually see the problem begin to get better.
All right. You're listening to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright. We talk about God and gun control. This is not an easy conversation, but it's one that needs to be made, and we need to make God the issue in this issue. So hang on, and we're going to get there.
Want to know more about how you can make God the issue in every issue? Get your copy of Brad's book, God is the Issue. Now in its 3rd edition, you can get your ebook copy at brightmedia.org. Even better, if you subscribe to this podcast, you'll receive a coupon for 1 free download of God is the Issue ebook. Go to brightmedia.org, that's brightmedia.org, and get God is the Issue ebook today.
Hey, welcome back to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright, as we're talking about God and gun control. All right, Brad, we've spent the last 4 segments of 2 podcasts laying out the case for gun control or against gun control. Can you give our listeners some tips about how to make God the issue in this gun control debate?
Yeah, and it's critical. But I think where you first start is simply by saying, and I mentioned it already, is you start by saying, look, I believe the primary cause of gun violence is education that omits God. I believe that's the primary cause. And of course, people, you say that and they go, I don't even get the connection, right? But I think that's where you start the conversation. It gets people's attention because they haven't heard that before. And most people, at least, are going to be curious. Now, a few people will say, you're a nutcase, right? You're a total nut job. But there's a way to frame this out to make your case and to make it pretty effectively. But it starts with saying, I believe the primary cause of gun violence is education that omits God.
I imagine that starts some great conversations. All right, you've stated what you think the cause is, which helps to focus the conversation on the cause rather than the symptom. However, I suspect a lot of people will get caught up there. They'll just get stuck there. And they won't agree with you, or they just won't understand why.
Yeah, and usually they won't. They haven't ever thought about the connection between the two. So now I want to give them a reason why, right? Okay, so I've said I believe the primary cause of gun violence is education that omits God. Let me tell you why. Because if you teach a child that God is irrelevant or that God doesn't exist, that child will eventually start acting as though God doesn't exist or he's irrelevant to morality. See, now you have given them a reasonable why for your statement. They may not agree, but you've given them a reasonable why. Now you need to engage them in a conversation about the cause by asking a question. You simply say, what do you think is the primary cause of violence? See, now you have moved the conversation to dealing with the symptom, that is gun control, to dealing with the cause. That's the conversation you want to have. So you've told them what you think the primary cause is. Now you ask them, what do you think is the primary cause? Now you can have a productive conversation.
All right. So you're trying to shift the conversation. You're pretty much forcing them to have a conversation about the cause as opposed to the symptoms. But what do you do if they try to move the conversation back to gun control?
I ask them this question. I say, look, on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you that gun control will solve the problem of violence in our culture? On a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you that gun control will solve the problem of gun violence in our culture? Now, most of the people, when you ask them that question, most people aren't going to say a 10. After you've already made your prior statement, you had this prior conversation about all the potential causes, they're probably not going to say a 10. Let's say they say a 7. I ask a follow-up question. I say, okay, what would have to happen to move you from a 7 to an 8? Now, then you were probably thinking I was going to say move you from a 7 to a 6, right? Move in my direction. No. What would it take to move you from a 7 to an 8? That is, that you'd be more convinced of your position. Why do I ask that? Because I want to get them to start self-critiquing their own position. And by making it safe, what would help you move from a 7 to an 8, that is, be more convinced, they can begin to critiquing their own position and they feel safe in doing it. You see, it seems counterintuitive at first, but what it does is it gets them to critique their own view, but in a way that it's non-threatening. But the point is you want to keep the conversation on the root cause of violence, and this helps bring it back. Now then, one heads up here. At some point, the other person's probably going to say, you don't have to believe in God to be moral. When they say that, ask, look, if God doesn't exist and survival of the fittest is the only remaining basis for morality, how do you get from survival of the fittest to Jesus' command to love your neighbor? Or how do you get from survival of the fittest to saying Black lives actually matter? How? If it's survival of the fittest, that is the strong survive and the weak die, how do you get to saying that Black lives really matter or that racism is wrong? You see, defining survival of the fittest as the necessary starting point of morality, if God does not exist, puts you in control of that conversation. No matter how they respond, though, no matter how they respond, push them to show how survival of the fittest justifies their conclusion. When it comes to gun violence, a broken view of God is the primary cause, because God really is the primary issue in gun control and in the whole issue of violence.
When you hear people talk about this on television, when you see people fight for or against gun control, do you wish that you could help them? How do we give you a platform here? I mean, how do we give you a chance beyond the podcast to get to speaking some sense into some of these political candidates and people that just don't seem to have a grasp on truly the cause?
See, the point of this podcast isn't so that Brad Bright has to go do all this. The point of the podcast is to equip our listeners to do this as well and to pass it on to the next person. You see, until we begin doing this as a larger group of people and engaging the God conversation as a larger group of people, 1 or 2 talk shows isn't going to make a difference. It's not. My heart, it's kind of like the hardware store jingo. You can do it. We can help. That's my heart here is you can do it, and I want to help you do it. You see, and together, by working together, we can begin to move this entire conversation back to the real starting point.
You're listening to the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright as we're talking about God and gun control. We'll be back with a final conclusion.
Brad Bright travels the country speaking and training people how to make God the issue in every issue. Go to brightmedia.org, that's brightmedia.org, to find out how you can bring Brad's highly interactive workshop to your area. It's fun, engaging, and most important, it will help make you more effective in making God the issue in every issue. Go to brightmedia.org, that's brightmedia.org, and schedule Brad today.
Welcome back to the God is Issue podcast as we close out this two-part podcast series on God and gun control. Brad, we've had so many conversations. We've covered so much material. Would you please just summarize this, put it a neat little, well, it's probably not a neat, but put a bow on it that we can walk away with?
This is what it boils down to, Jim. If there is no God, there's no ultimate authority in the universe. We each become our own God. If there's no God, morality is a fairy tale on the level of Santa Claus. If there's no God, what obligates me to treat you with respect? If there's no God, why is love better than hate? If there's no God, why is cutting the arms and legs off the fetus wrong? If there's no God, what's wrong with two guys having sex? If there's no God, why is murder wrong? The point is, you may not like it, but that doesn't make it wrong. See, a broken view of God allows dads to father children and then walk out. A broken view of God leads to a high divorce rate. And AWOL dads and a high divorce rate is the primary cause of poverty. See, a broken view of God leads to higher drug and alcohol abuse. A broken view of God leads to an epidemic of addiction to pornography. A broken view of God leads to higher abortion rates. A broken view of God allows Hollywood to justify anything for the sake of money. And frankly, a broken view of God drives many people to suicide or to embrace violence. See, a broken view of God leads to alienation from God, which leads to alienation from others. And alienation drives people to do awful things. So don't think for an instant that we can pass gun control laws and that'll take care of the violence. It won't.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for joining us today on the God is the Issue podcast with Brad Bright. Please check us out online for all of our podcast episodes and so many more resources, brightmedia.org, brightmedia.org. And remember, in having a conversation about God and gun control or any other conversation, always be kind, always be compassionate, always be shrewd while making God the issue in every issue.